At 6:23 on the morning of July 14, 1944, Sergeant Dale Hicks told Captain Bowen he could break the German advance across 600 yards of Norman farmland using the same method he'd used to drop coyotes on his father's ranch outside Marfa, Texas. Bowen stared at him. Two lieutenants standing near the farmhouse door exchanged a look. One of them laughed and said something about this not being a cattle drive. Hicks didn't smile. He said coyotes moved smarter than most infantry he'd seen in France. The 150 Germans pushing out of that tree line right now were using terrain exactly the way a coyote works open ground at range, angling toward cover, using every dip and fold to stay low, never crossing exposed earth in a straight line. He'd been killing animals that moved like that since he was 16 years old. He just needed a window, his rifle, and for everyone else to hold their fire until he said otherwise. Dale Hicks grew up on 4,000 acres of high desert in Presidio County, along the Rio Grande south of Marfa. Flat scrubland cut by dry washes, rocky outcroppings, and mesquite brush. Country where the sight lines ran unbroken for miles, and the heat off the ground could warp what you saw at distance. His father ran cattle. Coyotes ran through calves. The economics were simple. Every coyote that survived cost money, and every rancher in the county dealt with it differently. Some used dogs. Some used leg traps along fence lines. Hicks's father used a rifle. Long range. Open ground. One shot, or the coyote learned your position and never gave you another chance. He put a Winchester Model 70 in his son's hands at 16. A .30-06 with a Weaver K4 scope, 4-power magnification, just enough to pick out the twitch of an ear at 400 yards. Hicks learned fast that a coyote crossing open country never moved the way you expected. It didn't run straight. It read the ground beneath it, cutting towards shallow depressions, drifting along the low side of a rise, always angling for the nearest piece of cover on the far side. You could watch the animal all day and never get a clean shot, or you could ignore the animal entirely. You studied the terrain. You found the one stretch of exposed ground the coyote couldn't avoid, and you put the round into the space between where it was and where it would be in the next half second. Ranchers in Presidio County had a name for it. They called it reading the run. By 19, Hicks was making consistent kills at 380 yards on coyotes at full sprint. By 22, he'd pushed that to 450. The stock checkering on the Winchester had worn smooth on both sides from use. His hands knew the rifle the way a musician knows the neck of a guitar, without looking, without thinking. Pearl Harbor came when Hicks was 27. He enlisted the following month. Army rifle instructors scored him perfect at 200 yards, then at 300. His commanding officer told him the Winchester wasn't standard issue. Hicks said, "Yes, sir," and never turned it in. Nobody pressed the point. By the summer of 1944, he was a sergeant in Dog Company, 30th Infantry Division, grinding south through the Normandy hedgerows toward St. Lo. On July 13, Dog Company occupied a farmhouse complex sitting on a low ridge above a wide valley. To the south, an open farmland stretched roughly 600 yards before it reached a thick tree line where German forces had been staging movement for 2 days. At 5:45 a.m. on the 14th, German artillery found them. Shells hit the ridge in a concentrated barrage. Walls cracked, windows blew inward, dust choked every room in the farmhouse. Men pressed themselves flat and waited. The shelling lasted 8 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. At 6 a.m., Hicks moved to a south-facing window and looked out across the valley. They were already coming, 150 German soldiers advancing out of the tree line in a wide, disciplined spread. Not charging, not running, but moving with purpose, using every fold in the ground to stay low, are pressing north across that open field toward 50 Americans who had nowhere to go. Bowen did the math quickly. At their pace, the Germans would reach the farmhouse complex in under 10 minutes. Dog company could hold the walls, but if 150 men reached close quarters against 50, the numbers would do what numbers always do. Hicks wasn't doing that math. He was looking at the field the way he'd looked at open ground his entire life. Not at what was moving across it, but at what the land itself would force that movement to become. Presidio County didn't teach patience. It forced it. The land south of Marfa was not generous country. Summer temperatures cracked 110 in the open. Rain came twice a year if it came at all. The ground was caliche and dry rock, broken by mesquite thickets too tough to clear, and arroyos that ran bone dry for months then flooded without warning. Everything that survived out there, plant, animal, or person, survived by being quieter, slower, and more stubborn than the thing trying to kill it. Hicks learned that young. His father didn't explain much. He demonstrated. Morning chores started at 4:30. Fences got checked on a foot when the truck wouldn't start, which was often. Calves born in bad weather got carried to shelter by hand. Complaints were tolerated once. The second time, you got silence, which was worse. The coyote problem was constant. A single pack working the eastern pastures could take 3 or 4 calves in a week, enough to make a thin margin disappear entirely. Some ranchers poisoned bait, some ran dogs. Hicks's father considered both wasteful. A dog could chase a coyote for miles and come back empty. Poison killed things you didn't intend to kill. A rifle was clean. 1 round, 1 result. But only if you understood what you were shooting at. That was the lesson underneath the lesson. His father took him out the first time at 16. They sat on a low ridge above the eastern fence line for 3 hours before a coyote appeared. Hicks raised the Winchester. His father put a hand on the barrel and pushed it down. "Watch," he said. So Hicks watched. The coyote moved across open ground at an easy trot, not fast, not slow, angling slightly left, drifting toward a shallow wash about 300 yards south. It never ran straight. It adjusted constantly, reading the ground the way water reads a slope, always moving toward the lowest, safest line. His father told him to forget the animal. So look at the land. Find the one place the coyote had to cross with no cover, then wait. Hicks found it, a bare stretch of hardpan between 2 mesquite stands, maybe 15 yards wide. The coyote reached it 4 minutes later. His father nodded. Hicks fired. The coyote dropped mid-stride. He missed more than he hit that first year. Flinched on the trigger. Misjudged wind. Fired too early because the waiting made his hands shake. His father never corrected his aim. He corrected his breathing, his stillness, his need to act before the moment arrived. By 19, the flinch was gone. By 22, the waiting felt like nothing at all, just the ordinary space between deciding and doing. The rifle became part of the calculation. The worn Winchester, the Weaver scope, the familiar pull of the trigger. He didn't aim the way the Army would later teach him. He placed shots the way a man sets a fence post. Deliberate, measured, final. Years later, on a field he'd never seen in a country he'd never planned to visit, that same stillness, that same reading of ground and movement and distance would decide who lived and who didn't. The news from Pearl Harbor reached Presidio County on a Sunday evening. Hicks enlisted the following Monday. He didn't make a speech about it. He drove to the recruiting office in Alpine, signed the papers, and drove back to help his father move cattle before reporting. Basic training confirmed what the ranch had already built. At the rifle range, instructors ran him through standard qualification at 200 yards. Perfect score. They moved him to 300. Same result. A range officer asked where he'd learned to shoot. Hicks said Texas. The officer waited for more. There wasn't more. What set him apart wasn't accuracy. Plenty of farm boys could shoot straight. It was how he shot. He never rushed around. He never adjusted after missing. He adjusted before firing. Instructors taught soldiers to acquire a target, align sights, and squeeze. Hicks did something they couldn't quite name. He seemed to decide where the bullet would go before the rifle came up, as if the shot had already happened and he was just completing the paperwork. They didn't know what to do with that. His commanding officer flagged him as a potential sniper candidate, then dropped it when Hicks refused to give up the Winchester. Regulation said standard issue only. Hicks acknowledged the regulation and kept the rifle anyway. Nobody forced the matter. In an army preparing to cross an ocean, one sergeant's attachment to a .30-06 wasn't worth the argument. What the Army couldn't use, it ignored. Hicks went through infantry training like everyone else. He learned to move in squads, clear rooms, dig foxholes, and follow orders built around volume of fire and coordinated movement. He did all of it competently. None of it changed how he thought. He landed in Normandy in late June 1944. The hedgerow country south of the beaches was nothing like Texas. Dense, wet, closed in, with sight lines measured in yards instead of miles. Ambushes came from tree lines you couldn't see through. Men died from positions they never identified. The fighting was brutal, close, and fast. Hicks adapted without complaint, but he watched differently than the others. On July 13th, Wood Dog Company moved into a farmhouse complex on a low ridge overlooking a wide valley south of their push toward St. Lo. Open farmland rolled out below them. 600 yards of grass, shallow depressions, and scattered hedgerow before a thick tree line marked the German side. Most of the men saw a defensive position, a place to hold, rest, and wait for orders. Hicks saw something else. He spent the remaining daylight hours studying the valley from a second-floor window. He traced the contours of the ground the way he'd traced pasture land back home, noting where the terrain dipped, where it funneled, where a man moving fast would have no choice but to cross open ground with nothing between him and a bullet. He didn't mention any of this to Bowen. Nobody asked. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge that evening, Hicks had already mapped 3 exposure points across that field, places where the ground offered no option but visibility. He wasn't preparing to fight the enemy. He was preparing to read them. The shelling stopped at 5:53 a.m. 7 minutes later, the tree line began to move. Hicks saw them before anyone else did. Not because his eyes were sharper, because he was already watching the right place. The southern edge of the tree line, where the ground sloped gently into the open valley. The natural exit point. The place any group moving north would use because the terrain gave them no better option. Figures emerged in clusters. 5, then 10, then more. They spread wide as they cleared the trees, staying low, using the shallow folds in the ground the way Hicks had known they would. Disciplined, controlled, not rushing. And they moved the way men move when they believe they have the advantage. Steady, confident, with the weight of numbers behind them. Bowen counted from the west window. His voice was flat when he said the number. 150, maybe more. The farmhouse tightened. Men checked magazines. A corporal near the stairs asked about reinforcements. Nobody answered him. Hicks crossed the room to Bowen. He spoke quietly. He told the captain he could slow the advance from the second-floor window, that the field below had 3 points where the terrain forced exposure, and the Germans were walking straight into the first one. He asked for permission to fire before the rest of the company engaged. Bowen looked at him the way a man looks at someone suggesting an umbrella in a hurricane. One of the lieutenants shook his head. On another said they should wait until the Germans were inside effective range for the whole unit and hit them with everything at once. Hicks said by then it would be close quarters. 50 against 150 in a farmhouse wasn't a fight. It was a funeral. Bowen hesitated, then he nodded. One word. Go. Hicks climbed the stairs, positioned himself at the south-facing window, and rested the Winchester on the sill. The Weaver scope settled on the field below. He didn't look for soldiers. He looked for the first exposure point. The bare stretch of open ground between two shallow depressions, roughly 400 yards out. 15 yards of nothing. No dip, no cover, no angle to hide behind. The lead element reached it at 6:24. The first German stepped into the open and Hicks fired. The man dropped instantly. The sound cracked across the valley and died in the morning air. The formation kept moving. Momentum, training, the instinct to push through. A second soldier entered the gap. Hicks fired again. The man fell before he'd taken 3 steps. Then a third. Same result. Now the movement stopped. 150 soldiers, spread across 600 yards of open farmland, went still. Heads turned. Orders were shouted that carried faintly up the ridge. Men dropped flat into whatever depression they could find. The advance, which had looked inevitable 60 seconds earlier, simply ceased. Downstairs, no one spoke. One rifle had just frozen an entire army in place. For 6 minutes, nothing moved on the field. The Germans lay flat in the depressions and folds they dropped into after the third shot. From the farmhouse, Hicks could see the subtle signs of reorganization. Heads turning toward the east. Low hand signals passed between clusters of men. A non-com crawling between positions. They were adjusting, choosing a new route. Hicks had expected this. The open field below the ridge wasn't uniform. To the east, a thick hedgerow ran roughly north-south for 200 yards before breaking at a narrow gap, maybe 8 feet wide, where a farm track cut through. On the far side of the gap, a shallow drainage ditch ran north toward the base of the ridge. If the Germans could push through that gap and into the ditch, they'd have covered approach to within 150 yards of the farmhouse. It was the obvious move. The terrain practically invited it. Hicks left the south window without a word. He crossed to the east side of the second floor, found a window with a clear line to the hedgerow gap, and settled the Winchester on the frame. The distance was shorter here, roughly 320 yards. The gap itself was narrow enough that any man passing through it would be visible for exactly 2 seconds, maybe 3 if he was carrying equipment. 2 seconds was enough. The first group reached the hedgerow within minutes. Hicks could hear faint commands carried on the morning air. Clipped, urgent. They were moving faster now. The confidence from the initial advance was gone, replaced by something tighter. Purpose sharpened by the knowledge that stopping in the open meant dying in the open. The first soldier entered the gap at a crouch, rifle across his chest, moving quickly. Hicks let him take 1 step into the clear space and fired. The man collapsed sideways into the hedgerow. The second came almost immediately behind, close enough that he couldn't have seen the first man fall before committing to the gap. Hicks chambered and fired. The soldier pitched forward onto the farm track. Then a pause. Voices behind the hedgerow. The sound of men pressing themselves against cover they suddenly didn't trust. A third soldier tried the gap at a full run. Hicks tracked him the way he'd tracked a coyote, cutting across hardpan, not following the body but reading the line it had to take. He fired once. The man went down 2 steps past the opening. The gap fell silent. Downstairs, the men of Dog Company listened to the rhythm of it. 1 shot, a pause, another shot, another pause. There was no spray of automatic fire, no eruption of noise, just single measured reports from the floor above, evenly spaced, unhurried, final. When a private near the east wall said something quietly to the man beside him, the man didn't respond. He was staring at the ceiling as if seeing the second floor for the first time. Nobody was laughing at coyote hunting anymore. The Germans pulled back from the hedgerow gap at 6:41. They left 3 men in the dirt and took nothing with them except the understanding that the eastern approach was closed. The western approach looked like the answer. A low stone wall ran diagonally across the field roughly 300 yards from the farmhouse. Old fieldstone, probably a property boundary from before the war. It stood about 3 feet high. Not much, but enough to crouch behind. Enough to gather men, regroup, and launch a coordinated push up the ridge with numbers that still overwhelmingly favored the German side. Hicks watched them commit to it. These small groups broke from their positions in the central depressions and moved west in short bursts. 3 or 4 men at a time, staying low, covering ground fast between pauses. It was smart movement. Textbook. Each group reached the wall and pressed tight against the stone, invisible from the farmhouse windows. Within 10 minutes, Hicks estimated 30 to 40 soldiers had stacked behind that wall. Maybe more. He could see helmets briefly when men shifted position. He could hear the faint metallic sounds of equipment settling, magazines being checked. They were building something behind that stone. Bowen came up the stairs. He'd seen the movement from below. He asked Hicks what he could do about a target he couldn't see. Hicks said he didn't need to see them. He needed to wait. Bowen didn't ask him to explain. He went back downstairs, and the farmhouse went quiet. The men below understood by now that the rhythm of this fight was not theirs to control. It belonged to the man on the second floor, and the man on the second floor was not moving, not adjusting, not doing anything at all except watching a stone wall 300 yards away with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting for animals to make the one mistake that mattered. Behind the wall, the Germans prepared. Hicks could feel the pressure of it, the accumulation of men and intent, the compression that always preceded a charge. They would need a signal. Someone would have to stand, turn to face the men behind him, and give the order. One man, one moment. Fully exposed above the wall from the chest up. At 7:08 a.m., a German NCO rose. He lifted his right arm to wave the advance forward. His mouth was open, mid-word, mid-command, the first syllable of whatever order would send 40 men up the ridge. Hicks fired. The NCO dropped behind the wall before his arm completed the motion. No signal reached the men behind him. No command was finished. The word died with the man who was speaking it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a second soldier rose, cautiously, just enough to look over the stone. Hicks put a round into the wall 6 inches below his face. Stone fragments sprayed upward. The man disappeared instantly. No one else stood. Minutes passed. 5. Then 10. The men behind the wall had the numbers, the weapons, and the position to mount a devastating charge. They had everything except the willingness to be the next man to rise above that stone. The wall had become something it was never built to be. Not cover, but a cage. And every soldier pressed against it knew that standing up meant being the one that the unseen rifleman on the ridge chose next. They weren't pinned by bullets. They were pinned by the idea of one. The first mortar round hit the east side of the farmhouse at 7:22 a.m. It blew a hole through the upper wall and sent stone and plaster across the second floor in a spray of debris. The concussion knocked Hicks sideways from the window. Before he could reset, a second round struck the roof. Then a third hit the yard below. They'd found him, or at least they'd found the building he was shooting from. The distinction didn't matter much when the ceiling was coming apart. Mortar fire has a particular cruelty. You hear the whistle, then the impact. And in the space between those two sounds, your body decides things your mind hasn't approved. Where to move, what to cover, whether the floor beneath you will still be there in 1 second. Training helps. Experience helps more. But nobody is calm under mortar fire. The body won't allow it. Downstairs, Dog Company pressed against interior walls and crouched beneath whatever structure still held. Dust filled every room. A support beam cracked and sagged in the front hall. A private near the staircase caught shrapnel in the shoulder and was dragged behind the kitchen wall. The farmhouse, which had felt solid an hour ago, was coming apart in pieces. Hicks stayed on the second floor for the first 30 seconds. Then a round hit close enough to buckle the floorboards beneath his position, and he understood that the window he'd been firing from was finished. If he stayed, the next round would either collapse the floor or bury him in the wall. He moved downstairs and out the back door during a brief pause between impacts. 30 yards behind the farmhouse stood a stone barn, older construction, thicker walls with a pitched roof that faced south over the valley. The roof was exposed. No cover, no protection from mortar fragmentation. Any man on it would be visible to the entire field below. But the angle was better, higher, wider, a clear line of sight to every position the Germans had taken during the bombardment. Hicks climbed. He pulled himself onto the pitched roof, lay flat against the stone tiles, and brought the Winchester forward. The tiles were cold and uneven beneath his chest. The scope found the field. The mortars continued for another 4 minutes. Rounds hit the farmhouse, the yard, the ridge behind it. Hicks lay motionless on the barn roof and let the explosions work around him. One round landed close enough to rattle the tiles under his ribs. He didn't move. At 7:34, the mortar fire stopped. The silence came back, heavier this time, weighted with dust and the smell of scorched stone. Hicks swept the field through the scope. The bombardment hadn't been random. It was cover. While the mortars kept dog company underground, the Germans had moved. Clusters of soldiers had advanced from their pinned positions, pushing north through the central depressions, closing the distance they'd been unable to cross under fire. They were no longer at 400 yards. They were at 250, some closer. They were closer now than they had ever been. At 7:41 a.m., the Germans stopped trying to be clever. Roughly 60 soldiers rose from the central depressions at once. No feints, no flanking, no probing a gap or waiting behind a wall. They came straight up the field at a dead run, rifles forward, boots hammering the grass, closing the 250 yards between their positions and the farmhouse as fast as their legs would carry them. It was the correct decision. Everything else had failed. The eastern gap was shut. The western wall was a trap. The riflemen on the ridge had turned patience into a weapon and distance into a killing field. The only counter left was speed. Cover the ground faster than one man could work a bolt. From the barn roof, Hicks saw them rise. All of them. At once. He didn't rush. And the Winchester came up. The scope settled. And Hicks did what he had done 10,000 times on the flats outside Marfa. He stopped watching where they were and started watching where they would be. A man running at full sprint across uneven ground covers roughly 6 yards per second. The bullet from a .30-06 covers 400 yards in less than half a second. The math is simple. The execution is not. You have to read the runner's line, calculate the lead, and fire into empty space, trusting that the man in the bullet will arrive at the same point at the same time. Hicks fired. A soldier in the front rank pitched forward mid-stride and didn't move. He chambered, found the next line, fired again. Another man dropped, arms wide, rifle spinning away into the grass. Then a third, then a fourth. Each shot was a separate calculation. At each target, a different speed, a different angle, a different distance that was shrinking by the second. Hicks worked the bolt without looking at it. The spent casings pinged off the roof tiles beside him. Men were falling, and the charge was thinning, but it wasn't stopping. The remaining soldiers kept running. 200 yards, 175. The distance was collapsing. Inside the farmhouse, Bowen gave the order. Dog company opened fire. Every rifle in the building erupted at once. The sound was enormous. A solid wall of gunfire that rolled down the ridge and across the valley. Rounds tore into the advancing line from every window, every doorway, every crack in the damaged walls. The charge broke at 150 yards, not all at once. The front rank stumbled first, men diving for ground that offered nothing. Then the middle stalled as soldiers tried to find cover that didn't exist. The rear turned before the men in front did, peeling away in clusters, then individually, then in a full disordered retreat back toward the depressions they'd left 30 seconds earlier. The firing continued for another minute. Then Bowen called ceasefire. The field went quiet. Smoke drifted across the grass. Nothing moved in the open ground between the farmhouse and the tree line, except the slow shifting of shapes that would not be moving again. The charge had not reached the walls. The farmhouse still stood, and the silence that settled over the valley was not the silence of a pause. It was the silence of something that was over. When the last echo faded, Bowen walked the perimeter of the farmhouse and looked south across the field. The evidence of what had happened lay scattered across hundreds of yards of Norman farmland. Bodies in the open ground near the first exposure point. Bodies at the hedgerow gap to the east. Bodies in the grass short of the stone wall to the west. Bodies in the central depression where the final charge had broken apart. The distances varied, some beyond 400 yards, some as close as 150, but the pattern was consistent. Each man had fallen at a point where the terrain offered no protection. Each had been caught in the exact space Hicks had identified before the first shot was fired. The after-action count confirmed 25 kills attributed to a single rifleman. And the remaining German force, over 100 soldiers who had begun the morning expecting to overrun 50 Americans in a farmhouse, had withdrawn past the tree line and did not return. Bowen found Hicks sitting on the floor of the barn, his back against the stone wall, the Winchester across his knees. He was cleaning the bolt with a cloth he'd pulled from his pack. His hands were steady. His expression carried nothing that looked like what the men downstairs were feeling. The shaking relief, the disbelief, the wide-eyed processing of men who understood they should not have survived the morning. Bowen stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said something simple. He said he'd been wrong. He said it without qualification. Hicks nodded. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything about coyotes or Texas or reading the run. That he finished cleaning the bolt, reassembled the rifle, and asked when the company was moving out. That was it. No ceremony, no speech. The morning passed into afternoon. Dog Company continued its push towards St. Lo. The farmhouse became another position on another map in another after-action report filed among thousands. Hicks finished the war. He came home to Presidio County. He went back to the ranch, back to the cattle, back to the long sight lines and dry ground, and the coyotes that still came for the calves when the seasons turn. He didn't talk about Normandy. Neighbors knew he'd served. They didn't know what he'd done. He didn't correct the absence. Decades later, military researchers reviewing 30th Infantry Division records found the after-action report from July 14, 1944. The details were precise. Positions, distances, was sequence of engagement, number of confirmed kills. The report described a single non-commissioned officer using a personal rifle to disrupt and ultimately collapse a coordinated assault by a numerically superior force across open terrain. It matched no standard tactical doctrine in use at the time. The researchers noted the engagement, filed their findings, moved on. Dale Hicks died on his ranch. The Winchester was found in a closet, cleaned and oiled, the stock checkering still worn smooth on both sides. The field in Normandy is quiet now. Grass covers the ground where 150 men advance and 50 held. Nothing marks the place where one man saw what no one else could see. But on that morning in 1944, on a stretch of ordinary farmland that should have been a grave for 50 Americans, one man didn't just survive the war. He changed its outcome for everyone beside him.